GambleAware Week aims to increase awareness of gambling and gambling harm in the New South Wales community. GambleAware Week 2021 took place between the 18th and 24th of October 2021. The theme for GambleAware Week 2021 is Let's Talk Gambling. Gambling harm is a significant issue for the Fairfield local government area. Gambling addiction and losses can have negative impacts on individuals and the people they are close to. They can often be linked to household poverty, domestic violence, family breakdown, drug and alcohol abuse, and poor mental health. The use of poker machines in clubs and hotels can be addictive and problematic for some residents and their families. During the 2021 COVID-19 lockdown, these venues were forced to close in line with public health orders, and people were unable to use poker machines. This meant an almost 4-month break for poker machine players. While this break will have been beneficial, there will be people who will resume poker machine use at harmful levels now that restrictions have been lifted. The following presentations present information on how and why these relapses can occur and what people can do to try and avoid the harms. The following presentations formed part of the online GambleAware Week forum held on the 21st of October 2021. The forum was for local residents to understand how easy it is to fall back into problematic gambling habits, what harm this can cause, and where people can find help and support services. For further information on the range of services that have been brought in under the new GambleAware structure, please visit www.gambleaware.nsw.gov.au.
So we've got 4 segments happening today. I'll be presenting the first part, which is the behavioral strategies. So just to begin with the definition of relapse prevention, because that's what we're presenting today, is basically helping people sustain abstinence. Just a general definition. And it is important to point out the difference between male and female relapse differences. Recovery from gambling addiction study that whether male or female, the most popular relapse reasons are financial. So they include optimism about winning and need to make money. And that again is one of the biggest causes of gambling cycle. People gamble in order to pay their debt, which is originally caused by their gambling addiction. Just some points to include is that, interestingly, seeking excitement or enjoyment happen to be the least scored just the table. And that was something that I found interesting because from a lot of our clients, we expected excitement and enjoyment to be one of the highest, but it was actually the lowest of reasons for relapse. Another important thing to remember is that for men, a lot of times it's time to, to get away from being bored in life. And again, finding opportunity to make money. And again, lockdown has obviously increased people's intention to do more of this. And for females, a lot of times avoiding negative emotions or situations. And as you know, the domestic family violence rates have gone up during the lockdown. This is related to one of the reasons why gambling is increased during the lockdown. It is important to really look at your stress management, how effective they are. So during the lockdown, we've seen a lot of unhealthy lifestyles, and it includes myself. We've started drinking more, having takeaways, Uber Eats, Deliveroo's, all those foods which are really, really delicious and, quick and easy to get. However, again, because of the restrictions in 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers, we weren't able to exercise or didn't have the motivation to do normal exercise we used to. So this probably has decreased our chance to de-stress. And again, could have exacerbated our gambling addiction if we do have. So some of the coping strategies which related to stress management includes meditation, relaxation, mindfulness. However, if you are a religious person and then you probably read your Bibles or Qurans, or you probably pray a lot, and that's something that we can use as part of the stress management. And not only do we need to live a healthy lifestyle, and sometimes it can be quite boring to sustain our healthy lifestyle, and because it is important to do something fun something that's pleasurable in our everyday today. And I tell my some of my gambling clients that it is important to feel time and energy, money you spend on gambling, and you're trying to control and stop gambling. You need to refill those voids with these pleasure activities or something that's healthier. And I'm going to read out some of these ones. And something I found interesting was, going on a date, taking a bath, taking a nap is a pleasure activity, driving, fighting for a cause, that's doing a campaign, something. And we all have those passions for communities, again, and listening to the sound of nature, saving money, again. So we know that financial security is equal to mental health well-being. These are some of the activities you could actually look into during lockdown or post-lockdown. And I found this table quite useful for myself as well. So in terms, I'm talking about the behavioral relapse preventions. One of the things that we as counselors can do is help you to self-exclude. So self-exclusion is basically banning yourself from venues or online gambling sites for a limited number of time or periods. By law, Australian gambling providers must give customers the option to self-exclude from their venues or problem or products. And how does self-exclusion work? So basically you choose which venues you want to exclude from. That includes clubs, pubs, casino, and TABs. And you sign a deed listing the venues you agree not to enter for a certain period of minimum 6 months and a maximum 4 years. If venue staff see you in gambling area of the venue, they will report you to the program and ask you to leave. But this is not related to any police check or record in your police file. At the end of the agreement period of the deed, you can choose to self-exclude for another period to apply. So you can definitely extend your period or reduce your period. And that, again, has to be discussed with your gambling counselor if you do need to, because you do need a supporting letter. In terms of the gambling websites, because with the online gambling, most reputable gambling websites will allow you to block yourself from holding an account with them. That includes BetEasy, Sportsbet, Neds, Ladbrokes, Unibet, Bet365, which are all very popular online gambling sites in Australia. You can also buy products, software that will block your computer from accessing gambling sites. And if you're a parent, again, this is something you probably do with your kids a lot, because at these days, anything that's online can be quite harmful, and we need to be really smart in filtering those sites. And one thing I would recommend is keeping a diary. We call it gambling diary, a trigger diary, where you list some of the triggers that exacerbate, your gambling urge. So how triggers work? Triggers can be anything. It can be a sense of smell, touch, or someone's just mentioning the word gambling. It can be anything. And when you have the chance, just write down what it was on the particular day. And then you probably are related to how you were thinking or feeling that day, and whether your craving was high or low. You can probably put a score to it, and then you keep a record of it. And when you do seek help, there is a pattern, and we can discuss that in your therapy sessions. So I always ask my clients to do a diary, which is quite helpful. Lastly, and very importantly, gambling addiction is a spectrum. So you can, as you can see, the green zone is where it is okay, you're in control of your addiction. But red zone is where you're out of control. You're now unable to control your gambling. So it is important to talk to someone professional for help. There is 24/7, gambling line, as well as there's a multicultural services or mainstream services out there who are really there to listen to your problems, not only yourself, but anyone and everyone is affected by gambling addiction. We need to help.
I'll be discussing with everybody what we call a cognitive relapse prevention strategy, or I should say strategies, a variety of strategies similar to how Elizabeth has outlined for all of us some behavioral change strategies that may be helpful for people who are experiencing difficulties with gambling. And if that's any of you out there, and if that's or any of the clients that you may be working with, then we encourage you to get in touch with us, and we can certainly discuss further outside of this setting. Now, just in terms of some of the things that Elizabeth has already mentioned, with the reasons that people may experience a relapse or a lapse with their gambling, it was identified that optimism about winning and then the need to make money are among the highest and most relevant reasons for people feeling motivated to want to gamble again or to gamble at all. And what we've done at GambleAware, Southwestern Sydney, is we've for many years, in fact, we're originally the University of Sydney Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic, but now we're the GambleAware provider for the Southwestern Sydney region. For over 20 years that we've been in operation, we have sought to understand what is it that really gets someone gambling, and what is it that keeps someone gambling. And it's really important for us to examine this question from a cognitive perspective, meaning having to do with the certain thoughts and beliefs and things on people's minds, even images that have to do with gambling, that to use a word from Elizabeth earlier, that may trigger, or maybe a more appropriate word, prompt, that may prompt someone to want to gamble. And we have a treatment program at our clinic that actually examines the cognitive kind of underpinnings of any sort of gambling behavior, including any problems with gambling, very closely, and in a way that helps clients and those who are experiencing difficulties with gambling to overcome it at that level, which I believe is very complementary to the level that Elizabeth has already discussed about the behavioral strategies that people can employ in their lives. Now, one of the strategies that would be helpful for people coming out of the lockdown in particular is to calculate over the course of the lockdown, perhaps the savings that have been accumulated as a result of not gambling. Now, when I say not gambling, I mean specifically not doing so at land-based venues that have been closed for lockdown periods during the pandemic. And this would probably not apply as much with online gambling if someone has continued to engage in that mode of gambling. But I think it's important to look at how much someone can actually save, or how much you can actually save when gambling is not occurring. And then to compare that with the losses that would usually be taking place over a similar period, and properly understanding exactly why the savings are happening and why the losses are happening. One has to do with gambling, one has to do with not gambling, and the other. And I think it's important to really have in mind a way to offer some perspective in financial terms, because when anybody is in the midst of struggles with gambling, it's hard to focus on these things that maybe reflect a longer period of time. It's much easier to be focusing on what can happen now, what can I achieve through gambling now, perhaps. And often that has to do with feeling a motivation and a desire to want to win. And not just that motivation and that belief, but also the associated, almost like an imagined satisfaction of what it's going to be like if that outcome happened today on the gambling. If I were to win today, then maybe that would be, in my mind, that would look like a very desirable outcome, and certainly something that feels worthwhile trying to pursue today, and therefore justifies, in a sense, wanting to gamble today. But again, this is why I think it's important to calculate savings over a longer period of time, because what happens with gambling makes the most sense over a longer period of time. And that is always the case in no matter what form of gambling. And I think that's part of the problem with people who are experiencing difficulties with gambling. The focus is on a shorter period of time and not a longer period of time. It's more on the small picture as opposed to the big picture of the gambling. And this is why I think this is a very important strategy to have a look at, and to really consider the impact that gambling has, and the impact that choosing not to gamble has. What this also allows us to do is to project future savings and a future financial position, what that would look like without gambling. And this is kind of easy to do. How much has been saved in 3 or 4 months of a lockdown? Multiply that by 3 or 4 for a year's worth of savings, and then multiply every year, maybe for 10 years, and then 20 years. And in other words, the more we multiply, the more we can realize that there will be lots of savings without gambling, and that a person's financial position will be much better off without gambling. And although it may seem like common sense, the tricky part to it is that most to all of our clients would experience again more of a small picture focus, where it's just about, well, what can happen today with my gambling? And that small picture focus and perspective neglects, the distant past, and also the future, and I mean even the distant future, of what life can be like without gambling. And this is why we encourage these sorts of strategies with anybody who's trying to continue with their good progress that they've made with either abstaining from gambling or controlling and cutting down with their gambling. It's also important to consider future opportunities in terms of what can be presented in a person's life without gambling and what that could look like. And Elizabeth mentioned a good number of activities that anybody could be engaging in instead of gambling. And we could even call them substitute activities for gambling, or other sorts of pleasant activities. And it's also important to evaluate these activities in terms of the payoffs. Like, how do these activities make you feel? What does it afford you? What kind of opportunities? What kind of payoffs in your life? What does it do for your life? Does it make it better? How does it compare with gambling? I think it's very important to make all of these considerations again, just to be very reflective about gambling and how that contrasts with not gambling. In the course of the lockdown, it's also I think important to look at the impacts that not gambling has, and that has a lot to do with benefiting people's mental health. And I can say that with pretty much almost all of the clients who attend our services during the course of lockdowns, and most of them would be engaging in land-based gambling activities, such as playing the electronic gaming machines or the poker machines at clubs and pubs. During the course of a lockdown, there's a real relief, that these venues aren't open, that the gambling is not available, and that really is a benefit to somebody's mental health. Now, I recognize, of course, during the course of a lockdown as well, there's also many problems, mental health sorts of problems that could arise, and I think that's reflected in we see the certain support and resources that are being offered, including funding for services in this space to make sure that people get the help that they need. But interestingly, with gambling, I would say that it's maybe a little bit different. During a lockdown, it's a very positive thing for many people. In fact, during lockdowns, and this is both last year and this year, our referrals and intakes at our services decreased dramatically, and not just our services, but also across all of New South Wales. Now, that means that people did not need the services as much. They did not consider, that gambling was a problem for them necessarily while the lockdown was happening. And if that's the case, then it makes real good sense to try to continue to build on that and to progress in these cognitive strategies so that progress can be maintained over a long period of time and well into the future. And unfortunately, we look at what happened last year with the lockdown. There were a lot of people that went back to their gambling, and that's why we've thought to conduct this sort of a forum for the community today to make sure that people get all the support that they need, including if that's support to continue with the good progress that's been made during the lockdown. Now we'll just go to the next slide, please, Joseph. And another important strategy is to examine the lockdown effects on the gambling industry. And this puts something very important into perspective, which is there's a certain optimism about winning, or a feeling that someone may need to make money through gambling. Now, the perspective that I think this shows is that the gambling industry are the ones who are actually making the money. They're the ones who are actually benefiting financially from gambling. And it's invariably the case that people who are gambling and continuing to gambling, repeating gambling, will experience gambling losses, and those losses will continue to add up and accumulate in a way that will have a very serious effect on a person's financial and overall well-being in their lives. And I think it's very important to see how that's manifest during a period of a lockdown, and also how that compares with periods where we've opened up, such as what's happened in over the last week. And what that does for the industry. I'll just make a brief comment on that. Last year, there was a significant period of a lockdown, and after reopening, somehow more money was gambled across New South Wales than in previous years when there wasn't any sort of pandemic or lockdown effects. So that goes to show you that the industry is certainly benefiting from ongoing gambling behavior of the community, and I think that it's important to assess our gambling in terms of, again, a bigger picture perspective of how does it fit with what's happening at the industry level, and who's actually benefiting from this. Because if we were all benefiting from this, then I don't think that we would be having a forum like this to try to help people with stopping or cutting down with their gambling. I think if we were all benefiting from gambling sustainably, we would continue to gamble in the long run, which I don't believe is the case. Now, I've already mentioned this big picture perspective that is, I think, very important. And the big picture has to do with taking a step back and seeing all of these things, seeing as much as possible in terms of the long-term impact of gambling. As I mentioned before, with any sort of gambling struggles and difficulties, often the focus is, before a gambling session, is on the belief that maybe I could win today, is on the feeling that, hey, it's going to be very satisfying if I did win today. And that sort of an image really does motivate someone, really does amplify the desire to want to gamble. And during a gambling session, despite the losses that may be occurring, there always seems to be this ongoing belief that, I could still win despite these losses, and almost like a level of confidence and in maybe even in the sort of strategy or the way that someone is engaging in their gambling activity, that they could still win despite their losses. And I think it's important to try to take a step back and evaluate and reevaluate these things from more of a big picture perspective, because due to the nature of how all gambling activities are designed over the course of a long period of time, the more someone gambles, the more they will lose. And that is just by design of the different activities and games that are available. And it is the unfortunate reality of gambling that is maybe sometimes difficult to recognize and to be aware of for those who are in the midst of experiencing difficulties with this behavior. And it's very important for us to also emphasize the futility of gambling, meaning, sure, we could have some wins every now and then, and ultimately they would be temporary. Maybe they're nice in the moment, but in the long run, what's bound to happen? You look at a period of a lockdown and the savings that's happened during that period, and you compare that with what may happen outside of a lockdown period, and the negative impact that has on a person continuing to gamble. And you have to ask a really important question, which is, what is the point? What is the point of continuing to gamble if it's always just led to the same outcome ultimately, and that outcome keeps repeating itself and keeps accumulating in a way that creates more problems and is certainly not desirable in that sense. And it's really important that we highlight this feeling of futility, so that so that anyone who's experiencing difficulties with gambling will feel that it's not worth trying, that there's no point to continue to gamble in their lives. And finally, finally, all of these different strategies are about raising the level of awareness about gambling. There's different sorts of levels of awareness, and we've discussed a couple of them already in my time, and Elizabeth has as well. And Joseph will be saying some more about other levels of awareness as it pertains to gambling. But I'll just make one final comment, which is that all of these cognitive strategies at their core allow a person really to examine what is their life worth to them? What is the value of their life, and how does gambling fit in with that? And we hope that the answer invariably will be that it doesn't fit in, and that it doesn't do anything ultimately to help persons a life worth and value if they continue to gamble in a way that proves to be problematic in their lives.
When we look at what's relapse prevention, when it comes to gambling, we need to really take into consideration the context of that individual, because it's really important to, yes, focus on the behavioral aspect and doing that behavioral change, and also focusing on, the cognitive aspect in terms of how that person thinks and contextualizes their gambling patterns, right? That's really more so important as well, to really categorize this individual within the frameworks of their family, right? So some of the relapse prevention strategies when we're working with individuals is engaging them in retrospective with their families. So working with the whole family in a systemic way is really crucial and important, specifically when we're working with people from multicultural communities, right? Because the thing is, when someone has a gambling issue, right, and an addiction, what tends to happen is that they're not just the only person affected by it. It also impacts the family, and the family, by relation, also pave the way in how that whole addiction is experienced and framed. And just to give a little bit of context, what I mean by that is that if we start looking at the reasons for someone's gambling, then we can start to draw on, well, what is that person's family life? And if it's a bit turbulent, is it because of the gambling, or did it start before the gambling and the gambling is just a coping mechanism, right? And so we want to really work with, the whole family and engage them, right, in part of our treatment as well, where possible, because it's really about working holistically and really looking at that relational component of that addiction. We also want to, promote and increase the capacity for healthier relationships. So a lot of the times, people who do gamble, they can get triggered, what Elizabeth was saying, due to stress. And sometimes that stress can be caused by, interpersonal and intrapersonal, framings, right? So they can have arguments with their spouse, arguments with their kids, vice versa. And, what tends to happen is that they can get quite frustrated, and then the only component of how to express that anger and stress is to go and gamble, or to take up a coping mechanism that might not be helpful, right? So it's really about looking at the relationships and what those relationships look like for that person, and having the conversation of, like, can we, what does your relationship look like, and what do you want from that relationship, and really actually understanding how that person sees themselves in light of others is quite important. Because again, if they've had a previous history of gambling, then we really want to make sure that that person feels connected to their social network and family, so we can actually prevent that sort of stress and maladaptive coping mechanisms, which might, push that person into problem gambling, and then even, further up that sort of continuum into that pathological gambling, right? And so then it becomes kind of like, where we need more resources to get that person support from there. But in saying that, it's also helping the client understand the function for and the reasons why they might be gambling. A lot of clients come to us and they might not understand, or they might not even think about what it is and why they're gambling. I think it's, what Michael was talking before, like, why is it that you're drawn to this sort of behavior? And it's about really unpacking it in a way that engages relationships and how they form their relationship with others, because that is quite important. Now, this is all in light of the individual in retrospects of their family. The next slide really talks about, let me just go next. The next slide really talks about working with families, right? Because not every person who has gambled in the past would want to work with our service, but that doesn't mean that we can't offer support for their family members and spouses. And then hopefully by working with their families, we also provide a pathway of acceptance where that person feels a little bit more comfortable and approachable, where they can actually come and sit at that table and have the conversation. So it's all sort of that sort sort of, that biosocial psychological change that we can promote with the individual. But also it's, part of prevention strategy is really doing psychoeducation with the family to promote awareness about what that individual might be experiencing. Because a lot of the times, for people who are engaged in gambling, there might be a lot of blame, there might be a lot of stigma, shame, and guilt. And so that kind of creates them, that pushes them in a corner where, they kind of feel like they're, they don't actually, they have troubles connecting with their family, or they feel ashamed, and it causes all sorts of barriers because of that sort of misunderstanding of what might be happening. And sometimes family members are quick to judge, which actually marginalizes that individual who was gambling. So it's really important to have the conversation with partners, even children, adolescents, and really highlight where and psychoeducate where that person who is engaged in gambling, where they're at, so we can promote that sort of understanding, and I guess that solidarity. Sometimes as well is that the gambling can occur not just because of the family and the situation, but it can also occur because that individual doesn't have maybe a family to go to, or that sort of connection. So it's kind of like, it's kind of twofold here, because if they don't have that sort of connection that comes from family, they might feel more isolated. So another way, to work with them is we can still focus on that sort of family component, but also look at, beyond family into, next of kin networks and other people who might, that person can actually connect to. Also, keeping a focused eye on intimate partner, violence and DV in relationships where there is gambling and history of gambling. And when we talk about DV, I'm not just talking about DV purported or basically DV that's contributed by the person who's gambling, but I'm also talking about DV from the other spouse that can also increase the other person's gambling habit as well. So it's not necessary that the person who is gambling is being violent, but oftentimes most often that's the case, but it always changes in context. So, you're always going to get a different scenario in a different case, but really looking at how that is panning out in the family network and really drilling down on it to increase safety, and also, to create brokerage for that family. Because if there is violence, we really want to understand, is it happening? What sort of capacity is it happening and occurring in? And can we actually broker some supports to decrease the intensity and create safety for all members of the family, right? And so to do that, we really need to involve everyone and also get specialized supports. So really important stuff. And the other issue as well is that we really want to hone in and look at the children, because, with, families who have, individuals who do engage in gambling, there might be, lack of, I guess, scarcity in food. There might be, I guess, a lack of supervision. There could be all sorts of things going on, perhaps. So we really want to increase, eyes on the children, because what we want to do is increase that family's resources to be able to cope better. And if we kind of provide more support for the parents to look after their children, that means there's less pressure and strain on that family, which means that we can actually build more rapport and engage in better to work with that sort of relapse prevention. So really important. And also sometimes where, you do have quite vulnerable families, we also have to remember that, gambling is one of the issues in many. So we also have to reflect and work with other services, but I'll get to that a little bit later. We also want to highlight community strategies. And I just want to point out that, when we talk about relapse prevention, it should always be in the context of that bigger picture, what Michael was saying. So we want to go from the individual and look at ways where we can work with the individual, expand, to that sort of family, but then now let's look at a community level, because, it impacts everything and everyone, right? So working with interagencies to promote and advocate for problem gambling awareness, really important. And what that looks like is that sometimes, problem gambling gets overlooked, because it's assumed that, it's not an issue, or there's no need to talk about it. It tends to be overlooked. And so, the more we do that, the more we're losing the opportunity to screen and, sort of do that sort of relapse prevention. And, working with health professionals is really important, and again, it goes back to this notion of working across interagencies and communities. And that's, at Multicultural Problem Gambling, we tend to do that, and we have capacity to do that. So that's a real important part of our work. But going back to this is that, to the notion of working with others in the community who might provide support, is that also, coaching and promoting that sort of screening. And what that might look like for someone who's previously gambled is not being afraid to actually ask the question when they're presented in your office or when they're presented in front of you. Ask the question, have you gambled before? And if the answer is yes, then, are you currently gambling? And if the answer is no, don't stop there, right? Ask another question with a follow-up and investigate what has that look like for you? Because it very could be that no, if you move on from that, that's a great opportunity really to reflect on where that person is. And one way to do that is to ask a scaling question and be like, right, you're telling me that you used to gamble, but you're not doing it anymore. Are you experiencing any urges from 1 to 10? And really get them to talk about that, because if they say, yeah, well, my urges are a 9, well, then that person is at that sort of brink of going back to relapsing in that, in that pattern behavior. And then that's a great opportunity to start have that honest conversation, like, all right, let's work on this. Let's what sort of support would you like here, or what can we do? And then that's a great, also another opportunity to slowly, with permission and consent, to involve other family members to kind of strengthen that relapse prevention strategy, right? And we also want to be, that rapport and that honesty is always really important, and the authenticity. So coming from a space of non-judgment is really important. And also, working with other services, I think we all have different knowledges and ways of doing things. And I think, it's really important to share knowledge in what works and what doesn't. I think, because as we continually share, we start to learn things from one another. And the last slide, guys, I really just want to focus on, taking the opportunity to create spaces and places where we can actually have these conversations, I think are really, really important. Creating forums to have these and raise, awareness about these issues, really important as well. Because again, you never know what people take from that and then share with others. And that could be that pathway to recommending support for that individual who doesn't have access to events or resources such as this. Also, I guess, advocacy by delivering campaigns and programs. And I really don't want to say this as a superficial way, but when I say, develop campaigns and programs, I mean, let's do it the smart way. Let's be quite, let's make sure that they're specific, they're measurable, achievable, relevant, and then delivered in a timely manner, right? How effective are the campaigns? How effective are these campaigns? Who are they targeting? Why are we doing this? And, do it with a purpose, as opposed to just, let's do a flyer and off it goes, right? So doing something with purpose, really important. And, research is really big because it informs the practice and how we work. I think, working with community in a grassroots way and developing sort of that, solutions to gaps in knowledge and, working across different cultures and communities is really important too, because again, the addiction of gambling is also, it paves out and manifests differently across different cultures. So really having that, curiosity and not just assuming things is really, really important. And just positing yourselves as, what, I may not know everything about the individual, family or culture, but I'm always humble to learn more, as professionals, as service providers.
We'll just go to the next slide, and I believe we have our information here. Perhaps we'll just thank everybody, for your time listening in today.
Thank you for viewing these presentations. If you or anyone you know needs more information on gambling services available, please visit www.gambleaware.nsw.gov.au.